Humans are very superstitious by nature. For whatever reason, we seem to be pretty good at placing negative connotations on things that appear harmless on the surface. Black cats, broken mirrors, walking under a ladder, and of course that chain email you never forwarded to 15 of your friends from 10 years ago. One of the most fascinating superstitions to me, though, is easily the fear of the number 13. 13 is just a number, that's it, a 1 and a 3 next to each other. But for some reason, fear of this number has become heavily ingrained in Western culture. So much so that it even has its own phobia, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. Research has estimated that as much as 10% of the US population has a fear of the number 13. This group is littered with famous names such as Franklin Roosevelt, P.T. Barnum, and ironically Stephen King, who of course is partially responsible for creating phobias in other people, so kinda hard to feel completely bad for him. By some estimates, as much as 87% of high-rise buildings in the United States don't list a 13th floor. An equally high number of airplanes don't label the 13th aisle, and even cemeteries, which divide themselves into numbered sections called blocks, avoid using the number 13 as well. None of this is to even comment on the fear of Friday the 13th, which is its own equally hard to pronounce phobia. It is worth noting that the fear of this number is a uniquely Western phenomenon. In ancient Egypt, for example, 13 was actually considered lucky, and in Asia it's the number 4 that is surrounded with superstition. Nevertheless, this does beg the question, how exactly did this number become such a feared thing? Well, as we'll see, the number has found itself associated with some unfortunate events throughout history that seems to have contributed to its negative reputation. So sit back and let's figure out what exactly is it about the number 13. One of the first examples we can trace back to 13 being bad luck is the story of the crucifixion of Christ, where during the Last Supper, Judas, who was the 13th guest to arrive, ended up being the one who betrayed Jesus and handing him over to the Romans. Another example of a 13th guest ruining a dinner party is that of Loki in Norse mythology, who was an uninvited 13th guest to a gathering of the gods and ended up murdering Baldur, a god who was so beautiful and revered that his death brought grief and darkness into the world. So good job on that one, Loki. These two stories, particularly the one of the Last Supper, were actually the source of FDR's phobia, and as a result, he would never have a dinner party where the total number of guests added up to 13. Another less mythical example is the Code of Hammurabi, and the absence of a 13 law within its original text. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the earliest examples we have of a written ancient code of law, believed to have been written sometime between 790 and 750 BC. Oddly enough, the original version doesn't contain a Law 13, though it appears modern translations have since fixed this. Many historians have chalked this up to a clerical error during the writing of the original text, but some have argued that this is an early example of an institution avoiding the number 13 for its supposed bad luck. Which of these two is right, I'll let you decide. The Templars were an order of knights founded in 1118 AD. Their objective was to keep travelers safe during their pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the aftermath of the Crusades, and they became an extremely influential part of European politics, gaining a staggering amount of wealth in the process. Ultimately, though, they were betrayed by King Philip IV of France, who had run into something of a financial crisis after draining all of his kingdom's money fighting wars. He initially tried to fix France's financial state by exiling their Jewish residents and seizing their assets. However, that by itself was not enough. It was then he looked to the Templars and saw an opportunity. His plan was to have the entire order arrested on trumped-up charges, which he would use as an excuse to plunder their riches for himself. Over the course of several months, he sent letters out to high-ranking members of the French Inquisition, accusing the Knightly Order of participating in a multitude of heretical activities, including satanic worship, homosexuality, and black magic. These were all, of course, lies, but on Friday, October the 13th, 1307, he ordered all of the Templars to be placed under arrest. Every member of the order, from lowly stable hands to the Grand Maester himself, were arrested and charged with being heretics. Most of the order argued that the charges were false and wouldn't confess. However, after weeks and months of endless torture by the Inquisition, all but the most stoic among them confessed to the charges. One by one, they were all executed or exiled from France. The fact that these charges had been entirely made up was kind of an open secret among the public, and the Templars were considered martyrs who lost their lives to a wicked and unjust king. For King Philip's part, his victory was short-lived, as within a year of Grand Maester de Molay's execution, he would die from a stroke, never getting to enjoy the spoils of his plunder and with a severely tarnished legacy. The second appearance of a notorious Friday the 13th in our video is the Black Friday bushfires, which took place in Australia on Friday, January 13, 1939. The fire season of 1938 to 1939 was a particularly brutal one all around. Fanned by powerful winds that day, the fires quickly spread throughout the state of Victoria, burning almost 5 million acres of land. By the time it was all said and done, over 70 people had died, along with tens of thousands of farm animals and an incalculable amount of wildlife. The fires were so bad that ashes from the flames reportedly traveled as far as New Zealand, and witnesses in neighboring states described their towns being blanketed with thick black smoke pouring in from the wind. The devastation caused by the fires scarred the lands terribly, and it took several decades for the vegetation to fully come back in some areas. Regulations were put in place in the fire's aftermath to prevent it from happening again. This included placing watchtowers throughout the brushlands so fires could be spotted early and potentially contained before they spread. Officials in Victoria also began the practice of controlled burning during the dry season, so if a wildfire did get started, it wouldn't have quite as much fuel to feed it. Despite this, though, wildfires continue to be a terrible problem for Australia, and it's probably a little naive to try and argue this is some sort of proof that the number 13 is bad luck. September 13, 1940 would go down as the day the German army came closest to their prized target of murdering King George VI. In the early morning hours, pilots of the Luftwaffe dropped bombs in the vicinity of Buckingham Palace. King George and Queen Elizabeth later described hearing the familiar buzzing sound of airplanes overhead and staff members of their palace yelling "bomb" as the German planes flew over and dropped their payload. The bombs resulted in several injuries taking place and officials being wounded, with one even killed, but didn't really come close to injuring either the king or the queen. The royal family's advisors recommended they flee the country as a precautionary measure, but the royal couple refused. Their refusal earned them even greater respect among the British public, and the bombings ended up having the opposite effect that the Germans intended, boosting the morale of the British at a time where it was starting to wane a bit due to the constant air raids by the Luftwaffe. As we all know, the war didn't exactly end up going well for Germany, so while this might be an example of something bad happening on the 13th, it doesn't really seem to have mattered much in the grand scheme of things.
5 guidance.
Go guidance.
We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was.
Okay.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt.
You see an AC bus undervolt there, guidance?
Apollo 13 is perhaps the most famous example of the number 13 proving to be bad luck. The launch was successful, however, on April 13, 1970, one of the ship's oxygen tanks suffered a catastrophic failure that put not just the mission in jeopardy, but the lives of the astronauts on board. Thanks to some miraculous work on the part of Mission Control and the Apollo 13's crew, the ship was able to successfully navigate back to Earth after circling the moon. A few days later, they made a safe re-entry back into the Earth's atmosphere using the ship's lunar module, where they landed in the ocean and the astronauts were rescued by life raft. While it is certainly one of the more famous stories of the peril of space exploration, it is by far and away not the most fatal, though it definitely had the potential to be a complete disaster. The event would go on to be immortalized in history books and on the silver screen, and of course as a cautionary tale about the supposed unluckiness of the number 13. For our next story, we move away from the stars and back down to Earth. October 13, 1972 was one of the most disastrous days in commercial aviation history. Aeroflight 217, a Russian airliner flying from Paris, France, crashed just before it was to land at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow. All 164 passengers and crew on board were killed in what was at the time the deadliest crash in Russian aviation history. Across the globe, Uruguayan Flight 571 carrying 45 people, including an amateur rugby team, crashed in the Andes Mountains in Argentina. Luckily, only 12 people were killed, but unluckily the survivors would not be found for over 2 months, resulting in several deaths due to the harsh mountainous conditions. By the time they were found, 17 more people had died, with the remaining 16 survivors barely clinging to life. In the aftermath, these survivors described in horrific detail how they had to resort to cannibalism and other unthinkable measures to make it out alive, making this example of an unlucky 13 truly one of the most gruesome on this list. So there you have it. A few examples of the negative events throughout history that are associated with the number 13 and have contributed to its not-so-stellar reputation. Whether or not you believe the superstition is for you to decide. If you can think of anything that we left off this list that should have been here, feel free to comment below. For what it's worth, if you're the 13th person to comment, either Joe or myself will reply wishing you the best of luck. Thanks for watching.